Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
The number of people out of work fell between April and June, according to the latest figures. There was also a surprise drop in the number of people claiming out-of-work benefits in July. Our economics correspondent Andy Verity is here, and that was a surprise because it was the month just after the vote to leave the EU.
Yeah, that's right. You don't have to have that long a memory, Sophie, to remember the pre-Brexit vote era, where there were predictions from the likes of the International Monetary Fund that after a vote, we'd have unemployment going up. But they were also saying that in the run-up to the Brexit vote, there was uncertainty that was causing a slowdown, which appeared to have harmed the jobs market. Now, these figures have a bit of a time lag in them. We're now looking at the period from April to June for the official unemployment number, and that's showing that it fell by an estimated 52,000 to 1.64 million in that time. But significantly, we also have the first official data on the labour market from after the vote, as you mentioned, from July. Now, that's the claimant count, which isn't as reliable. It's based on the number of people claiming job seekers allowance and the like, 763,000, but significantly it's down. Now, that's quite against most economists' expectations and a bit of a bright spot in the economic data following the vote. Now, of course, you can't place too much reliance on it. We won't really know whether the jobs market has been harmed or not by the decision to leave the EU for a few months' time. And there are some downbeat numbers coming out from other places suggesting that, for example, permanent placements are slowing down and there isn't as much confidence among employers. But certainly there isn't gloomy news here such as to distract you from all the good news coming out of Rio.
Andy Verity, thank you.
Now, there were many prophecies of catastrophe from Remain campaigners in the run-up to the EU referendum, but today's unemployment figures seem to show the UK economy so far taking the result in its stride. The number of people claiming unemployment benefit fell in July, while the number in work hit another record high. The claimant count numbers are significant because they cover a period entirely after the referendum result was known. Many economists thought they would rise by 5,000, assuming Brexit uncertainty would make firms cut back on hiring. Instead, they fell by 8,600, the first time they've gone down in 5 months. The number of people in work rose by 172,000 over the 3 months to June, taking the total to 31.8 million, the highest number ever recorded. The bulk of those figures came before the referendum, so any impact from the result would be minimal. They do suggest all the uncertainty around the EU had little effect so far on the labour market. But it's very early days to judge how the economy will be affected by our withdrawal from the European Union. All the key issues, from access to the single market to levels of migration, still have to be argued over, let alone agreed. Businesses may not know the final shape of our new economic relationship with the rest of the EU for years to come. So were the prophets of doom wrong? Rupert Harrison was economic advisor to George Osborne before moving to the world's largest investment manager, BlackRock. Jared Lyons provided the economic brains for Boris Johnson and campaigned for Britain to leave the EU. He's currently chief economist at Net Wealth. Rupert Harrison, were the warnings wrong?
Well, as you said, I think it's still too early to say. I mean, today's figures were better than expected, but really the employment and unemployment situation is what economists call a lagging indicator. So what it really tells us is how has the economy been doing for the last 6 months? And what we know now is that in the run-up to the referendum, in the first half of the year, the labour market was very, very strong. We've got the highest employment rate in our country's history. So that's really what we learned. It's true that some people were expecting the claimant count, which was the one piece of data we had today, which came after the referendum, to start showing jobs being lost. But I think, you know, what it's telling us is there was no immediate panic, but it really is too early to say. I think we're not out of the woods. If we are going to have a serious slowdown, which other indicators suggest we will, that's something we're going to start seeing in these numbers over the 3-4 months ahead.
Jared Lyons, nothing more to worry about? Or
what the last few weeks show us that predictions or prophecies of financial Armageddon were clearly overdone, not just in terms of jobs data today, but more particularly in the way financial markets have behaved in the last 6 or 7 weeks since the referendum. But I do agree with Rupert, it's far too early to say what the full impact is. Now, even though I argued that Brexit will be in the long-term best interest of the UK, and I still think it will be, and we will really benefit from it. I was saying before the referendum there would be an economic shock from Brexit. Now, the outcome for the economy depends on the interaction between the economic fundamentals, policy and confidence. The fundamentals are not too bad, as we see from today's jobs data. The policy environment is very conducive to growth, with the Bank of England acting. Confidence is maybe the key near-term factor that we can't really predict. And the biggest danger is that we talk ourselves unnecessarily into a self-fulfilling downturn.
Well, I mean, what are you still looking out for? What are you worried about? I mean, do you think hiring will be cautious?
Well, there are a lot of other indicators which are more forward-looking indicators of the economy, which tend to be surveys of businesses about how much do they plan to invest, do they plan to hire more people. Those, unfortunately, are much more negative, and they are indeed telling a story much more like the warnings before the referendum. And what we are going to find out over the next few months is, are those surveys overdoing the gloom, and is the hard data going to turn out better, like today's data, or are they in fact, as they have done in the past, correctly foretelling a slowdown? I mean, I personally wouldn't expect a short, sharp recession. I don't think that's what you're going to see. I think you're going to see more of a slow, protracted period of very low growth, because it's businesses, it's the uncertainty facing businesses that they think, I can't invest, I can't hire that person, I'm just going to wait and see what happens. That's what is happening at the moment.
Well, I don't doubt that there will be some near-term weakness in the economy. I don't think there will be a recession. But what's interesting is the unemployment or the employment figures are not necessarily a lagging indicator. Indeed, partly because of all the supply-side reforms we've seen in the last 20 years, many people would say that the jobs data are very good indicator of where things currently stand. And interestingly enough, about 2 weeks ago, the European Central Bank, so obviously very independent in terms of this debate, released their latest economic bulletin. And the reason for mentioning it is that within it, they highlighted that the UK economy probably has one of the most flexible economies in the world and is therefore better suited and better able to cope with economic change, whether that change is good, as I think Brexit is, or whether it's bad, as some people on the Remain side think it is.
The trouble is, nothing much has happened yet.
Yeah,
and we don't even know what our negotiation position is. So let's just talk about that.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, how important is free trade as we go into our negotiation?
I think we have to be more specific, because one of the problems actually is that people think it's just free trade or tariffs and barriers to trade. It's much more subtle than that, and the modern economy operates in a much more complicated way. And I think that if we end up in a relationship with Europe where all we have is free trade under the World Trade Organization rules, that's going to be a very big shock to a lot of industries.
Because it will mean tariffs.
We have the single market. It won't necessarily mean tariffs, although it could in some industries, but we have the single market. It goes far beyond any free trade agreement that exists anywhere else in the world. What it means is that if you make something in the southeast of England, you can sell it in the south of Italy without going through any border checks, without anyone checking where the inputs into that material have come from, without anyone checking whether the regulation that you made it under was the same as the market you're selling into. That's how the modern economy works, and that's what the single market delivers. And I think that what we're increasingly seeing is that the form of Brexit that we're heading towards is not going to preserve the single market in large areas of our economy. I think very likely not in financial services, and probably not in other areas as well. And therefore, that raises very big questions about how those more subtle barriers to trade, which are really the fundamental issue that we face, how are they going to affect businesses in the UK and their ability to sell overseas?
And this is because we're not prepared to accept freedom of movement.
Look,
So what is the cost of that?
OK, we do not need to be in the single market. We need to get this out of our heads. There's no doubt that for certain businesses, their business model means that they would be best suited to be in the single market. But in terms of the national interests of the UK economy, it's yet to be proven, and it's certainly, I don't agree.
Despite everything Rupert's just said.
Well, let's look at the reality of the situation. OK, being in the single market means we can't have return of sovereignty. Being in the single market means we can't have a sensible migration policy. But more than that, in terms of economics, you do not need to be in the single market to be able to sell into the single market. And in terms of the European Union, as we all know, the European Union is very bad at doing trade deals. Many businesses who were against voting Remain and in favour of Brexit argue that, quite rightly, that when we were in the EU before the referendum, our demands were one of 28 countries. Services never figured. Indeed, services don't work properly within the single market. And in terms of the city, the previous government, in terms of the coalition government, 2 years ago had a competency report and highlighted that being in the single market did not allow the city to influence the regulatory agenda in the EU and affected our competitiveness versus New York, Singapore.
We shouldn't go over the rehash the
No,
argument.
it's about what our position should be now.
We voted to leave and we're going to leave. The question is there are degrees of leaving, and there is a choice, at least an interim choice, which we could at least spend a few years, which would be something more like the European Economic Area, which is what countries like Norway have.
Worst.
At least as a point of transition. Because I think if you do leave the single market, as Gerard is saying, it's true you can still sell into the European Union. Countries like America still sell into the European Union, but at vastly greater levels of complexity and cost than we currently can. So what the problem is, you've got a costly transition. You've got a lot of companies, a lot of jobs dependent on those companies that are used to a certain way of doing things that is costless, that is frictionless, and that happens very easily. And you're going to have to make a transition to an economy where you can still sell, but you are at a competitive disadvantage to companies that are not in the single market. You face new costs, you have to make transitions. And that is going to be a shock, as Gerard says. And the bigger the difference, the more you leave the single market, the bigger that
Can I just briefly ask you, just because you also know how government works, having spent so long in number 11, what we've seen, according to the newspapers, is a row over who should run trade policy and whether it should be taken away from the Foreign Office. Do you think that's a sensible way for the government to run the future? For Liam Fox to be given half the Foreign Office, basically?
I mean, I think the reality here is that this negotiation is going to be done by number 10 and the Prime Minister. And within governments, you're always going to get turf wars, particularly, I think, this government negotiating these very difficult issues. Ultimately, this negotiation is not going to be done by Boris Johnson or Liam Fox or David Davis. It's going to be by Theresa May talking to Angela Merkel and Francois Hollande, or whoever wins the French and German elections next year. And really that's where the decisions are going to be made. Yeah. And the strategy is also going to be developed at the centre. It's going to be, what kind of Brexit does Theresa May want to deliver and how is she going to do it? That's the choice.
Theresa May will be heading to the G20 in China in early September. And she, I think, recognises that this is a great opportunity with Brexit to position the UK globally. We don't need to be in the single market. And the EEA, the Norway deal, is the worst of all options. We need to actually be embracing free trade, recognising that outside EU, we save money, we can position ourselves better, and we actually can think globally. Rupert has highlighted some of the benefits, no doubt, for some firms, but for the country as a whole, I think the Prime Minister needs to be positioning us slightly differently.
And do you also feel that your whole austerity programme is being dismantled? Everything you and George Osborne worked on?
No, I mean, I think that...
Well, not everything, but I mean, just pull down to some degree.
I think there's 2 points. There's the economics and the politics. On the economics, we've seen the results, which is we have the highest employment rate in our country's history in the run-up to the referendum, and over the last 6 years, we've grown as fast, I think a little faster than the United States. So, we've worked on that. Obviously, now we've got this economic shock, and the right thing for the government to do is to respond to that shock. The Bank of England first. I think the government probably do have a little bit of room in the autumn statement to spend a little bit of money on maybe infrastructure or tax cuts, because we've got a smaller deficit than we had in 2010. We've got a bit more room for manoeuvre, and we have got this very unusual shock facing the economy. I think on the politics, the break with the past is mainly rhetorical. I think I would be doing exactly the same thing if I were Theresa May. I'd be saying it's a new government, it's a new broom, we're doing things a different way. In reality, in most areas, it's going to be, I think, largely continuity.
Well, since the referendum, we've benefited from a weaker pound. We're benefiting from a change in the Bank of England stance. But I agree with Rupert, we need to be doing a lot more in infrastructure. It's about innovation, investment by the private sector, enabling the private sector, and a lot more infrastructure spending in the autumn statement.
Gerard Lyons, Rupert Harrison, thank you both.
I've been getting away